So our construction management program and others are really exciting programs. And this particular program is directed by Dr. Ezber Andrioglu. And it's really a practice-oriented and advanced graduate degree that offers a cross-section of construction and business management courses, leveraging the expertise of the College of Engineering, the School of Law, the School of Architecture, and the Miami Herbert Business School. It's designed to develop leaders and managers for complex building projects with mastery and best practices related to resiliency, sustainability, building information modeling, project delivery, and decision-making. The program also fulfills the College of Engineering's missions to create new knowledge, recreate knowledge for education, and translate knowledge for commercialization and apply that knowledge to serve the community. I was just saying to John a few minutes ago that in my research area that has a more medical focus, one of the adages we have in that area is see one, do one, teach one. And I think the theme that we're seeing here is creating new knowledge, recreating knowledge for education, and translating knowledge for commercialization and application to serve the community are exactly modeled and relevant to that model that I was familiar with before. So as all of you know, Miami is a booming metropolis where commercial and residential construction is a large and important industry. And the subject of today's webinar is very special and it's very topical because COVID-19 has affected many areas of this industry and others. At the university, we have been impacted as well. Going back all the way to February when the pandemic emerged on the global stage, and our own decision in early March to go completely online for the rest of the spring semester and then to design the fall semester. I think higher education and construction are two industries that have been dramatically impacted by the pandemic. And I'm sure everyone is saying that as well. Now, at the university, it's also had other practical impact as well, and in particular on various ongoing construction projects. For example, the Frost Institute of Chemistry and Molecular Science. It sits just off to my left. The Knight Recital Hall, which is just along the periphery of the campus. Our residential villages, the Lakeside Village that just opened, as well as the Centennial Residential Village that's currently under design and development. I can't imagine that those projects that we're anticipating now getting out of the ground are not going to have to be reconsidered and rethought in light of the lessons learned from this pandemic. So I know we're all eager to hear from our featured speaker, John Murphy, who so graciously offered to lead today's webinar along with his colleagues. John is a partner at Baker McKenzie, corporate and securities practice. He has over 22 years experience helping clients navigate complex international project development and financing, capital market transactions, M&A, and general corporate matters with an emphasis on power and infrastructure. As mentioned earlier, John also co-chairs our Master of Science in Construction Management Advisory Board. It's my pleasure to welcome you, John, to our meeting this afternoon, our seminar. Thank you so much for your participation and your support of this particular event. Back to you.
Thank you very much. We're very glad to participate in this and share some of our experience. And hopefully everyone will find it useful and informative. Before we start out, I just wanted to quickly introduce my colleagues. Our first speaker, who will be addressing the perspective of the owners in projects, is Anastasia Gerasimovich. She's a real estate, a partner in our Chicago office in our global real estate practice. And she's worked with a wide range of clients, including not just owners, but contractors, architects, and engineering companies in all phases of construction projects. And, you know, she's worked on projects across the board, commercial, warehouse, retail, mixed use, and religious properties in over 100 jurisdictions. She also has significant experience structuring and managing the domestic and real estate portfolios of multinational companies. She's lived and worked in the US, Germany, Great Britain, Switzerland, Russia, and Belarus, and she's fluent in 4 languages. And so we thought that she would have a very unique perspective, and having worked here and in Russia and in Europe, just from the vast different types and different locations of clients around the world, to provide us with a unique perspective. Our next speaker is Matt Martin. He's a senior associate. He's also qualified in multiple jurisdictions, both here in Illinois and in the UK. And he's worked in our London and Chicago offices, and has recently been assigned to work in our Mexico City office. He has over a decade of experience advising sponsors, owners, utilities, developers, lenders, contractors, and equipment manufacturers on the development of major projects across all industry sectors. He's covered power, oil and gas, mining and process plants, infrastructure, manufacturing facilities, as well as a range of mixed use and high value commercial developments. And he's worked not only in North America, but in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and obviously the UK. Our final presenter after myself will be Katie Johnstone, and she's a partner in our real estate practice in New York, and her focus is in commercial real estate transactions. And she's worked with clients in all kinds of projects in the real estate field, acquisition, development, financing, leasing, and disposition of projects. And she's also done commercial leasing, retail and office developments, and real estate finance. She also has worked on infrastructure projects and in the energy and renewables space. So we're looking forward to an interesting review from the industry and what we've been able to perceive across jurisdictions, across different types of clients. And we will start it out from the owner's perspective with Anastasia.
Thanks so much, John. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to cover owner's perspective with respect to COVID-19. So as a result of the pandemic, construction industry members have been forced to address business challenges and formulate project-by-project solutions. However, before developing those project-specific solutions, we would always advise project owners, especially those with global construction portfolios, to develop a holistic and systemic approach on how to handle all of those notices and claims. So on this slide, you can see a 4-step process that we have been following for our project owners. First, we would analyze the contractual position for a particular owner, which would include force majeure analysis, whether it exists or doesn't exist in that particular contract. Maybe there is another term such as excused delay, and often we would deal with excused delay clauses where contractor would not be able to control transportation of materials or completion of project due to governmental requests and restrictions. And so we would analyze those and how it would affect owners' rights and remedies. We would also go into suspension and termination rights analysis. If the project has to be suspended, all parties will need to understand the consequences of such suspension. For example, the site will have to be secured on a 24/7 basis, the insurance will have to be maintained, and then the question is also what is happening with respect to remobilization, right? What is happening when the project will be reopening? Who is going to bear those additional costs, and whether they will be split or whether it's a contractor who's going to bear them. And then we would go into the impact on payment and pricing analysis, whether pricing will be affected at all. Again, it will depend on the pricing model that is being used in those contracts, if it's fixed fee, cost plus, or JMP contracts. And I will talk a little bit more about those pricing models later in the presentation. In addition to examining the existing contracts, we would also work with owners, especially again, those who have global construction portfolios with projects all over the world. We would develop a general legal force majeure memo, and that would be used for business and legal professionals as well as project managers. We would explain what force majeure is, because a lot of times business people do not understand the legal consequences of this term. We would also explain the differences between the civil law understanding of force majeure and common law. So for example, under civil law systems, force majeure generally exists as a doctrine established by the civil code, and force majeure concept embedded within the code may actually override the contractual terms agreed by the parties. Whereas under common law systems, force majeure will not usually apply automatically. Force majeure is rather a creation of a contract or meeting of the minds. So the agreement of the parties will be enforced in most common law jurisdictions with respect to force majeure, but then it's not necessarily the case in civil law jurisdictions, and that is important for owners to understand. Also, in the end of the day, if we look at the whole doctrine of force majeure, it's actually in the owner's best interest to avoid force majeure provisions in the contract, because most of the time they would be benefiting contractors. I'm usually working with AIA form contracts for commercial construction projects, and as some of you may know, they do not include specific references to force majeure, although some of the events and remedies associated with force majeure apply through other contractual mechanisms, such as extension of time provisions. So after this first step, as we analyze the contract and force majeure and what that means, we would go into the second step and we would work with project owners to understand the changing legal context. And here I mean the governmental restrictions and regulations on all kinds of levels, federal, state, local, municipal, and we would be carefully studying and monitoring them because, for example, in New Zealand, you may have alert level 1, 2, and 3. In India, you may have certain construction activities that are completely banned in Bengaluru territory, but then at the same time in Delhi, you may have 25% capacity labor force that is allowed to work on the construction side. So that is important to understand and track regularly. And then finally, once we analyze the contract and then governmental restrictions, we would still focus on successful project delivery with owners. Despite all of these hurdles and of course, impact on time and budget, we would still work with owners to get that goal going, right? To complete the project, successfully complete it. And for that, it's important to collaborate with contractors. Sometimes there is a position that, well, you know, if contractors didn't contact you, maybe we should stay silent and wait when they contact us. But because of such unprecedented times and this COVID-19 pandemic having unclear and unexpected consequences, we thought that it's much more important to collaborate and to be transparent in communications, and that would just avoid any surprises later. So then we go into the step 4, when we would respond to all of the notices and claims that we would get from engineers, contractors, and other counterparties. We would collaborate. We would set up teleconferences with all of the parties, and we would go through any impacts that COVID-19 had on critical path, delays, what are the mitigation efforts taken. So that kind of was a first step in this process. We would also go and develop jurisdiction-specific memos by working with local counsel in many various jurisdictions. For one of the clients, we created an impartial COVID-19 steering committee that would oversee the client's responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then finally, we would have trainings for owners, project managers, and other business professionals so that they understand the governmental orders and restrictions, and we would also ensure this unified response to force majeure claims. And now I would like to turn to Matt to cover the contractor's perspective.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I think it goes without saying that COVID has been a massive challenge for contractors and engineers. Often they're already under pressure to deliver projects to tight schedules with considerable liabilities for liquidated damages if they're late. Often they're working within pre-agreed fixed or guaranteed maximum prices, often with a tight profit margin. And even if they've spread their risk across a portfolio of projects, suitably risk priced the unforeseeable events that may occur and allowed for generous contingencies, COVID is the once in a lifetime event which impacts every project that they're working on. So there's a sort of a series of different, some obvious impacts. Firstly, mandatory site closures, or perhaps worse than mandatory site closures are uncertainties around whether or not sites actually do need to be closed. For projects that have been able to continue or which have remobilized after site closures, which is now most projects, there's now social distancing that needs to be factored in. Established processes and ways of working need to be remodeled, and of course productivity is impacted. There's supply chain disruption, and not which impacts just a single material or deliveries from a single region, but potentially impacting multiple components and materials, potentially on a global scale. Contractors are facing unavailability of plant and potentially increased cost of supply too. There's issues with staffing. There's a constant threat now of individuals calling in sick, having had symptoms, having to isolate, contractors having to make the decision to isolate whole teams on a construction site that's been in contact with anybody that's shown symptoms. Particularly for projects outside of the US, travel restrictions have been a major issue impacting site management teams, the ability of labour to travel to site, and the ability of engineers and consultants to perform their various functions too. I think contractors have a challenge managing the expectations of different owners and their varying approaches to COVID. Some owners have demanded that sites close, others have demanded that they stay open. Some take an understanding, flexible and collaborative approach to sort of working through the consequences of COVID, whereas others are holding firm to their sort of contractual rights and not sort of giving any time or cost to the contractor. As Anastasia's already touched on, and we'll explore further, the inconsistent position under contracts as to whether COVID is force majeure, as to whether there's change of law protection, and sort of related issues around how contractors protect their claims. We'll come back to that. And then, of course, there's the reality for most contractors that they're also exposed to and need to manage subcontractors and suppliers who oftentimes have concerns and sensitivities and who might make claims which don't necessarily correspond with the approach and attitude that the general contractor wants to take. So as I've already touched on, COVID gives rise to overlapping but different issues for each different project. Contractors obviously have limited resources, limited time and cost contingencies, limited margins to play with, but they have to find ways to deliver successful projects in spite of COVID, and often in spite of the contractual terms which may work against them, whilst also managing their business and taking advantage of available furloughs, loans and other government incentives. Contractors are focused on trying to deliver projects and protect and even enhance their reputation for being adaptable and capable of successful project delivery in trying times. And they're dealing, of course, with an uncertain pipeline of future projects. As we'll hear later, certain industries have been heavily impacted by COVID. Certain industries have seen a sustained level of new activity, and then as a positive, there's the potential for involvement in significant infrastructure projects as governments look to boost their economies in coming months and years ahead. So in summary, it's a hugely challenging environment and ever-changing. It remains hugely uncertain, and contractors therefore need to do all they can to protect what rights they do have in their contracts, whilst also strengthening and leveraging themselves as much as possible to improve upon the contractual position, so as to sort of best manage their way through the implications of COVID. Back to Anastasia.
Thanks, Matt. So now that we looked at the unified strategy and response that owner and contractor take, it is important to note specific considerations for owners and contractors to be aware of during COVID-19 pandemic. And I will start with the owner's perspective. So it's critical to prioritize health and safety. As we know, local government and governmental agencies such as OSHA in the US and European Agency for Safety and Health at Work in the EU, they have been issuing guidance specific to construction job sites to ensure safe working conditions during these unprecedented times. We have also seen, especially large construction companies, developing very robust COVID-19 programs that would incorporate various measures on how to make the site more secure. Those measures would include temperature monitoring, hand washing stations, social distancing, medical nurse station, mandatory wearing of masks, gloves, hydration guidelines, and of course, continuous disinfection of the site. And what was interesting, once we would see that robust program from large construction companies, we would discuss those measures with owners, and then owners would discuss those measures with smaller construction companies that maybe do not have the exact capacity to implement those measures. But for owners, it's important that all of the sites around the world are secured and health and safety is prioritized. So those construction companies on a smaller scale would take example from those on a larger scale, and they would implement not all, but some of these measures, which was very, very interesting to observe. Then we would advise owners to be informed of all of the operational and regulatory restrictions. So for example, if such restrictions prohibit access to the site or performance of any work on the site, then contractors or consultants should be ready to wind down, cease the work, and secure the project site. And then the question is, who is bearing the costs of security? So those should be subject to reasonable cost controls, and if the project shuts down, then project owner may agree to contribute reasonable cost to secure the project site through a change order. And we have seen such situations a lot where the split for security costs has happened. What is also important here for owners is to review all the permitting requirements relating to the project, because if the project is suspended or shuts down, then there's a question if there is a need for extensions of permits and other governmental approvals. We would also advise owners to be proactive. As we mentioned before, positive dialogue, collaboration is very important. At the same time, we would caution owners to refer to terms such as force majeure, because especially in common law jurisdictions, this may tend to imply that contractors or consultants may have certain contractual entitlements, even though they may not exist in the specific underlying contract. So it's better not to infer or even indirectly trigger those terms. And then if claims or notice of potential claims have already been asserted, then again, we would advise owners to affirmatively reach out to contractors and then discuss the impact on critical path, delays, the budget of the project. We would also remind contractors that project owners will be treating fairly everyone, but at the same time, each particular scenario will be based on facts and circumstances analysis, because we didn't want to create precedent with the same contractor for all kinds of claims. We would advise owners to keep records, and that's probably one of the most important points here, because you have to document all of the impacts, all of the mitigation actions, governmental orders. For example, if contractor is not able to source materials anymore due to orders shut down, the question is, are you able to source materials for an increased price from an unaffected supplier? And so these alternatives are being studied constantly by owners, and we would work together with them to analyze those. Document delays. If delays affect critical path. Determine if activities can be performed elsewhere. Of course, that concerns more pre-construction and design activities rather than construction administration or construction phase activities. But that's, again, something to be aware of when someone is claiming that they're not able to perform in a particular jurisdiction. We would work with owners to develop claim management protocols. So for example, before occurrence of any losses, we would help develop claim management protocols, and we would advise owners to work directly with their risk management team and insurance advisors so that they can work together and coherently to assist with a claim. Notify insurers and gather data for any potential insurance claim filing is very important. Inform and collaborate with all the stakeholders. That's important because sometimes we would think that the construction project is only about designer and construction company and owner, but at the same time, we have so many other third parties involved. And these are governmental entities, insurance advisors, sureties, bonding companies, banks that provide bank guarantees. So they have to be involved in this dialogue to avoid surprises at a later stage. We would also advise owners to focus on resolving COVID-19 claims. So instead of kind of focusing and spending time and energy on lawyering up and jumping into litigation arbitration mode, we would ask owners to focus on mitigating and resolving COVID-19 claims. And here, one of the examples could be if owners would get a claim from a subcontractor or supplier where there is generally no privity of contract between owner and subs and suppliers, we would just tell them, reject that claim, ask the GC to handle those, and then don't spend your energy on navigating that relationship between subcontractor and owner because there is no need to do so. And then finally, pricing considerations. Owners should be aware of the contractual pricing structures that they have. So for example, if this is a cost plus contract, then of course owners will bear all increases to cost of the work. With respect to COVID-19, of course, there are possible cost containment actions. They may include issuing a stop work order or amending budgets and project schedules to provide for the bifurcation of work between suspended work and ongoing planning and design work. As to GMP contracts, contractors bear cost overruns if GMP has been fixed. But then, of course, we would have to assess whether the owner will allow contractors to use contingency from within the GMP to cover additional costs. And then finally, similar to GMP contracts, if it's a fixed sum contract, then this contract protects owners since contractors already agreed to perform the work for a predetermined amount. And now I will turn to Matt for his discussion on contractors' key considerations.
Thank you. So I think first, and it probably goes without saying, is that the contractor should comply with mandatory legal requirements. It's obviously critically important that contractors stay abreast of this as the legal landscape continues to change and varies from state to state and city to city. I think one of the challenges for contractors has been working out, with all this new guidance, what is mandatory and legally binding, and what is mere guidance and best practice. A huge volume of material has been produced by legislative bodies, government agencies, industry associations, and the like, around how working practices should be adapted. I think as a rule of thumb, sort of compliance with everything that's binding and it is necessary, but also then properly analysing everything else that's out there, because that probably sets a level of expectation as to what's reasonable to expect of your contractors, and therefore what's reasonable to expect in terms of mitigation, which we'll come back to later. I think one of the problems as well with mere guidance and then with the additional steps that a contractor may itself choose to take over and above government guidance is that it becomes much more difficult for contractors, engineers to claim against the owner for those. Although many contractors, of course, have still taken the view that those ways of working are necessary in any event. Unfortunately, it's not always clear what the legal position is as well, and that can be risky territory for contractors. So refusing to work when instructed to do so could amount to a repudiation of contract and give rise to sort of significant damages claims. We did quite a lot of work on pharmaceutical facilities for which there were sort of essential services exemptions to the various shelter home orders. But then we found that actually it sometimes fall on the contractor to make an assessment or determination as to whether or not a particular project it falls within the exemption or is prohibited. And of course, the risk there is that if the contractor takes the decision that it's not allowed to continue and therefore law requires it not to, but it's found that actually it did fall within the exemption and the owner wants to pursue that, then the contractor could well lose the entitlement that they may otherwise have had to extensions of time. So I think sort of close liaison collaboration with relevant stakeholders and authorities is critical. Second, a thorough review and analysis of the contract terms relevant to the particular project is required. Of course, this is a similar exercise to the one already described by Anastasia, but this time it'll be contractors trying to establish whatever claims that they may be able to bring for extension of time, additional cost, or otherwise. Of course, contractors often first look to force majeure, and much has been written about this concept in the last six months. Anastasia's already covered it, but I think the key points from a contractor's perspective, skipping notification, which we'll come to separately in a moment, but the key points for contractors are to identify and apply the precise test and verify what relief or reliefs force majeure offers under the particular contract. The test may turn on foreseeability of a particular event and whether this is beyond the control of the parties. Force majeure clauses typically operate to release a party from its obligation to perform for the duration of the force majeure. And what that typically translates to in this context is an extension of time which avoids or defers the liability that a contractor may otherwise have had when the project doesn't meet the contractual schedule due to the force majeure event, due to the COVID-19. But a force majeure mechanism doesn't often provide reimbursement or compensation for any costs incurred in relation to the delay. That risk is usually borne by the contractor, although that's not exclusively the case. There's of course various scenarios at play in relation to COVID. There's the shutdown period. There's then, during that period, it may well be impossible to perform, and that may very well be a force majeure event. But when it's not impossible to perform, when it's just more difficult or more costly because of need to comply with social distancing and government guidance, often that won't be a force majeure event and sort of can be trickier for the contractor to claim. So force majeure is not the only option available. There's, as Anastasia mentioned, there's extension of time claims, additional cost provisions, which in different circumstances, different contracts throw up opportunities to bring claims. Change of law provisions, they often are more focused on the cost implications, although as noted earlier, it's probably not for you sort of need to look at the different ways of working and make an assessment there. So whatever the contractual basis is for a claim, it's critical that the contractual procedures and processes set out in the contracts are carefully and timely followed. In particular, notice provisions, they need to be strictly complied with. This is critically important for contractors due to sort of time bars which exist if there's non-compliance. So you don't want to miss out on the opportunity to claim for additional time or additional cost because you failed to get a notice in. So that's been sort of an area that we've had to sort of heavily focus on, making sure that contractors are complying with timing and content requirements for those notices, and making sure that contractors don't miss the opportunity to get that extension and avoid a liquidated damages liability, which might otherwise be significant. Couple of final points. Fourthly, need to maintain an open dialogue with the owner. In many instances, construction contracts don't offer full protection for the contractor, and while the contract positions do set out the default position, there's often scope to negotiate around these issues. Some contractors find themselves able to play hardball, and we've seen instances where contractors are not under a fixed or guaranteed price arrangement where they're putting in claims for tens of millions of dollars to cover the impacts of COVID on their projects. Many don't find themselves with that luxury and have to sort of leverage as much as possible, which often means sort of meeting the owner at the table and appealing to the owner's focus on successful project delivery and sort of trying to negotiate some preferred positions on that basis. Of course, the general contractor also sits in the middle of various relationships with subcontractors and suppliers, and so needs to manage those as well. I think we've touched on mitigation already, but the point really is that it's essential to take all reasonable steps to minimise the impact of COVID and governmental restrictions on a project. Contractors should be looking at reprogramming the works, replacing labour that can't attend site due to illness or self-isolation. Should look at the supply chain and see whether there's alternative suppliers who can meet or better the deadlines offered by those that they usually work with. There may be opportunities to continue design activities whilst working from home. It may be possible for certain contract administration, site inspections and certifications to be undertaken remotely, particularly with sort of improved technology. It may even be that there's sort of opportunities to prefabricate certain components off site. And those are all things that ways in which we've seen contractors responding to the challenges of COVID. And of course, sort of key to all of this is record keeping, as Anastasia's already mentioned. Contractors absolutely must keep very detailed records of every conversation that they have, of every effort they take to overcome COVID, of every decision that they make not to comply with sort of best practice. And construction disputes often turn on who's kept the better records, and poor record keeping is going to jeopardize any claims that may arise. So it's one that's easy to avoid. Anastasia?
Okay, thanks, Matt. Actually, a very interesting comment someone just sent. As a large private held construction contractor with projects across 16 states, we're not seeing any consistency in the response from owners, who in our case are mostly either federal government or state agencies. That's very interesting. And it's not surprising. When we are talking about a systemic and holistic approach from an owner perspective, it's an ideal case scenario, right? That's something that should be the goal of every owner, to have that consistent response. Unfortunately, with federal agencies and state agencies, there are two issues, different incentives and also funding sources. So from a private owner perspective, the incentive is, I would like to work with this same contractor again. I would like them to bid on my projects again. I don't want to renegotiate certain clauses again, which is why I would like to work together and collaborate with the construction company. The same with funding, right? If I would like to work with that contractor and have a good relationship with them for years ahead, I better split those safety and security costs. Okay, maybe if it's millions, I would think about that. But if it's $500,000 and I have 90 plus projects all over the world, maybe I can be okay splitting that to 50K, right? So that's a very interesting comment. Thank you for that. So now that we talked about kind of general perspective of owners and contractors, and then we touched upon the key considerations, we wanted to just briefly touch upon new negotiation points and settlement points that we keep seeing with COVID-19. Suspension is one of them. Whether parties have the right to completely or partially suspend the work, and which party will bear the added costs resulting from suspension. Here we talk about increased costs for labor, material, security, additional safety measures, construction permit extensions, and then, as we mentioned before, what happens after suspension when the reopening comes in. And we work very hard with our clients to kind of think strategically long-term, because there may be second wave, we need to shut down again, we need to suspend again. And so we're trying to have that roadmap in front of us so that we are ready to react quickly, and which is why you have to be proactive and you have to think about those things ahead of time. Second is compensation, whether compensation would extend to just the cost of delay or to other impacts as well. Force majeure, we have covered with Matt this extensively, but the question here is whether any contractual force majeure provisions or similar clauses that excuse timely performance will need to be revised. And if they need to be revised, whether they have to include epidemics, pandemics, governmental orders, as well as methods to mitigate the effects of force majeure events. We have drafted extensive clauses that would cover COVID-19, and we tried to be very broad when it came to definition of the pandemic, because you may have COVID-19 second wave, you may have another pandemic, and so the key is to define it broadly, but then at the same time cover known and unknown effects as they may affect compensation and timely performance of the project. Then changes or additional work clauses, whether owners can require contractors to perform changed, new, or extra work, The scope and compensation scheme for additional or changed work should also be incorporated into the revised contracts. And as we mentioned before, we have examples of shared additional costs between owner and contractor. There are different incentives for doing so, but again, the relationship with contractors is important to many owners. They would like to work together again and again on various projects. So some of the owners are happy to share those. Insurance policies, whether insurance would cover it in the event of pandemic. As you may know, sometimes we would see that pandemic or epidemic is a very clearly excluded event from the insurance policy. So that's important to understand. Termination rights, whether owner has a right to reevaluate the economic feasibility of moving forward with the project and whether he may consider terminating the contract. And I think Matt mentioned the changes in applicable law, whether construction project would be impacted by governmental orders that place restrictions on global supply chain and on the actual construction. And then finally, the payment schemes. We have seen certain payment schemes that have been used to adjust certain fees and expenses around the labor and supply chain markets. For example, there is a cost plus fee scheme. This is where owners will pay contractors for work based on the actual cost incurred for labor or purchase of materials, plus then a fee to cover overhead, profit, and certain ancillary costs. Another scheme we have seen is the capped added cost scheme. This is where we would set a limit on added costs resulting from certain unforeseen events, and any costs beyond such limit may need to be covered by contractors. And then finally, shared savings clause. Contractors will be paid a percentage of the difference between the actual cost and maximum price. And then this would encourage contractors to find labor and materials that meet the industry standards, but at the same time, that will be reasonably priced. And now I will turn to Matt to discuss the contractors' negotiation issues.
Sure, and so just to sort of wrap up this part of the presentation and pass over to John. I mean, many of the points of contractors are similar to those that that have been mentioned by Anastasia. I think contractors obviously want to get change orders signed to secure the time extensions and additional costs and other changes that are necessary to overcome the impacts of COVID-19. We've seen lots of owners sort of throwing in language to their COVID-related change orders, which looks to make it sort of a full and final settlement of all COVID-related consequences, preventing the contractor from making future claims in relation to COVID. And I think the message to contractors is sort of exercise caution, take your time and sort of properly review any change orders or any documentation that's being entered into in relation to sort of COVID settlements, as it's sort of far too early to make those sorts of arrangements. I guess another issue facing contractors is entering into new contracts, putting out new proposals, and the sort of the unavoidable uncertainties in trying to price and schedule those new projects in the current climate. We don't yet know how long the restrictions are going to remain in place or whether there'll be further waves. So what we're seeing is contractors and engineers making certain assumptions and qualifications in their proposals and in their contracts. They may be based on the present condition at point of bid, a point of contract. They may go into some detail actually as to what working arrangements and restrictions are allowed for in the price, with then some sort of mechanism to allow for adjustment of time and price. If there's changes to that, if there's improvements, it may mean that the contract price is reduced. But it all depends on contractors' eagerness to and necessity of securing new mandates at this uncertain time. I think all contractors that we're working with are focused on securing appropriate extensions of time. There's probably a bit more flex in relation to additional money. The one final point I was going to mention was that this is a good time to make sure that you have a really robust and flexible supply chain. I won't dwell on it further because I think sort of there on time, but it's a point that we'll be happy to talk to you about separately. John.
Thank you, Matt. Next, we'll go to explore the lender perspective. I thought it would be good to start out giving a sense of what the total market is right now, and to show it in it's a little hard to read, but the bottom, the light blue color on the bottom of the bars represents non-residential construction loans. And the top, the darker blue, is residential construction loans. So as you see, they both non-residential and residential construction loans have been steadily increasing since 2017. The current total volume with US banks is $380.61 billion, and that represents approximately 3.46% of the total loan and lease portfolio of the banks. And what's interesting to note, the yellow line shows percentage of the aggregate loan portfolio of US banks. And what we see here is that it's been relatively stable between 3.4 and just under 3.6% of the total loan portfolio since the beginning of 2017. So we're not seeing banks exiting this sector and favoring other types of loans. They've been pretty consistent. And in fact, at the end of the second quarter, non-residential construction loans rose 4.2% to $300.35 billion. Residential construction loans fell slightly, but only 1.4% to $80.25 billion. Just as a note, the difference between and the definition and the way these regulatory filings work that we are the source of the data, residential loans for construction are defined as building, the proceeds are used for building 1 to 4 family residential properties. So anyone here in the audience that is in the multifamily space and has 49 unit properties, those would be considered non-residential construction loans for financing. Anything over 4 family residents is grouped in the non-residential part. Okay, the next slide, that gives you a sense of the total lending. And as I said, lending continues, and it's been steadily increasing over the years and has not pulled back either in absolute or in relative terms to other types of lending. But here is the issue of concern. This shows us delinquency as of the end of the second quarter. And you can see generally it was declining in the non-residential construction loan space over time, which is to be expected because our economy was at minimal unemployment. The stock market and everything was booming. With everything going well, you would expect the trend downward. But in the COVID period, you can see there's a substantial spike in the delinquency total. This totals not just the ones that the banks are classify as non-accrual, which means they're over 90-day past due, and they have to show on a cash basis. Normally, if I owe my lender a payment at the end of September and it just slips my mind and I don't pay it till October, if the loan's generally performing and there's no issues, they'll still record the income in the third quarter as if I sent it in September. But if it's non-accrual, it means they don't expect payment. So they can only show payment if there's an actual payment. And so the difference in status is important, but this also, for predictive purposes, they've lumped in everything over 30 days past due, essentially. And you can see there's been a significant increase especially in the non-residential construction loan market. So there's now 2.78 billion of non-residential construction loans in delinquency and 875 million of residential. So they're each around 1%. Obviously the non-residential is a higher percentage, but close to 1% of the total portfolio of their type of loans. Just for everybody's interest, if you want to know who's lending, and who's most active in this space, this is the ranking. It's interesting. Wells Fargo far outranks everybody else, particularly in the non-residential construction loan. So they have more than twice the number 2 bank, which is US Bank, in that space. Some other interesting things in here are Bank OZK has spiked, and their percentage or proportion of total loans and leases of construction loans out of the total is 36.4%, and that's an 18% increase, 18.5% increase since last quarter. Another notable is PacWest. They have 17.5%, and for residential construction loans, they've increased 69% since last quarter in their lending. But you can refer to this, and if anybody's interested in who's participating in the market and who the most active lenders are. The concern, especially as we're thinking about delinquency, is what's the source of repayment for lenders? If it's a strict construction loan, how do you repay it? You either finish and sell the asset and repay it, or you get revenue from the asset to repay it. When we're talking about in the prior presentations, the concern of the various factors leading to delays, you have supply chain issues if products and building materials are not available on time. Obviously everybody faced, they have to plan and take the additional time to implement, getting PPE, training everyone, the, increased testing. If you're testing all the workforce on site, their temperatures every day, obviously if you can't have your full contingent of people working at once, all these things push you into a delay in the anticipated timing. So the period in which typically during construction, most times interest is capitalized and the amortization starts, either as a bullet when everything's complete and the asset can be sold, or it's pushed out to start when it's scheduled to be completed. Banks don't want to be open-ended. They're not, as they'll be happy to tell you, equity investors. So they don't set up these agreements open-ended to take as long as everybody wants or needs to finish. So this delay is a problem, and this is probably part of what we're seeing in the delinquency. Beyond just the mere delays in completion, COVID has caused these increased unbudgeted costs, and we heard from Anastasia and Matt, that's a big discussion, and how you allocate between the owner and the contractor, regardless of what the contract may have said, there's a cost there. The thing is, unlike if there's a long-term relationship between owners and contractors, where each side wants to make sure the other remains fully solvent and willing to work with each other, the banks are never going to say, okay, well, we'll contribute more, we'll write down, and we'll bear part of the increased costs that you needed to undertake to comply with the protective measures put in place, or with the delays, or with problems with your supply chain. The banks have a fixed commitment, and they have something in construction lending which is called the balancing condition. In order to borrow, the banks all assume that there's a certain amount of equity put in, and they look at every draw as you're going on during the project at how much it's anticipated to complete construction. And if there's not enough in the mix of equity and the committed debt, the owner or the borrower have to put in the difference, and that creates the balance. So if you're looking at this from the borrower perspective, you planned to outlay a certain amount and get a certain return on the project. You may be, in a situation where the owner ultimately is in financial difficulty because of everything going on and be unable to make that contribution and to pay. Or, these are, if the construction lending is really on a project basis and there is no recourse to the owner, and the owner may decide, well, we were willing to do this project when we thought it was great, but if the project, for example, is a new corporate headquarters for a cruise line, maybe they don't want to continue and put in substantially more money at this time. And so you have to realize which situation you're really in, and that kind of drives the conversation with the lender. If it's just a temporary delay issue, there's going to be one reaction from the lender or one conversation. But if it's going to be, we're going to walk away as the owner, it's a totally different conversation. I mean, obviously these agreements provide that the lender can step in and complete the project, but if the owner who's an expert in the business, if it's not for financial reasons, is willing to walk away because it doesn't make sense in their view to throw good money after bad, we're not going to see the bank making that decision most likely either. These situations and these delinquencies, when they become non-accrual, impact the financial statements of the bank in the following ways. From the income statement perspective, they have to, if they reach the determination, there's all kinds of guidelines, that you're not going to be able to fully recover at the bank, they have to have a provision for loan loss. And that goes in the income statement. And so it affects your quarterly income. If you were making, $100 million this quarter, in terms of cash coming in, but you have to add another $20 million in provision for loan losses, it's going to drive down your income. And, we've seen the banks, because the construction industry isn't the only one that's in increased delinquency, obviously, with, lower income reported during the first and second quarter of this year for precisely this reason. And then, that amount that's provisioned is added into, on the balance sheet, the loan loss reserves, which is a contra asset. So it lowers the assets of the banks. Okay, we can go to the next. Here's the, I think, key takeaways, from the situation that borrowers can keep in mind. I think the first lesson is to make sure that you're aware of and understand your overall credit obligations. I mean, it makes sense, and that was the situation when we were talking about the construction contracts earlier. There are several areas where you're going to want to focus on. The delays affect what I call the milestone issues. As I said, the banks have all built in, a certain time for completion, and with that in mind, when repayment is supposed to occur. So, in communicating to the bank, you want to have a good idea and a good communication on the anticipated duration. If you only had, setbacks for supply chain issues, and you want to be able to project out what the discounted cash flow impact will be and what it's going to cost you going forward. There are also financial covenant monitoring issues, And there we see a lot that, you really need to understand and make sure you understand the terms. I mean, people often think, oh, they understand. The biggest term used in monitoring is EBITDA. It's a proxy for the normal case cash flow, free cash flow of a business. But it's a defined term. Lawyers define it, and you have to understand it's defined. It's not under general accepted accounting principles. So it's always defined by somebody, and it's not always defined the same way. People might think, oh, because of COVID, my situation has declined. I might be in default of the financial covenant. Well, the theory is that extraordinary items aren't supposed to be included. It's supposed to give you a general sense. So it's worth taking a look at this with your legal advisors and see if the COVID-related costs, can be backed out, and your finances might actually be better than you think in terms of covenant compliance. Again, if there's changes in the underlying project documents that we talked about, again, you want to put together and package properly the discussion on the impact of timing and the projected impact on the future cash flows from the project. If there are any other things operationally that have been difficult in terms of reporting and issues, this is the time. If you have to extend out the term to clean up those other things. So the earlier you think about and be proactive about this and check with your legal advisors and come up with a plan, it all tends to work a lot better. And that flows into the next point about the importance of effectively communicating. In situations where lenders receive no information, they assume the worst. I was representing a lender in a financing to a U.S. subsidiary of a global engineering and construction company. They missed an interest payment. I sent them a notice of default on behalf of the lender. They didn't answer us for months, and there were multiple outreach to them. So finally, the lender told me to file a suit in New York because it was governed under New York law to get our money. So we didn't hear from them until after we filed a lawsuit to collect. That's not the situation you want to be in. You have to understand, what lenders are generally willing to approve. We're in a good position to add value there as legal advisors because we've seen what they've done, the same banks, in multiple other deals. So you want to make sure you get a grasp on, what's doable and what's not. As I said, presenting the story in terms that dovetail with their needs. Once it's become a regulatory problem, it's a bigger issue for them. So if you know that things are happening and there's going to be a problem at the end of the third quarter, you want to try to clean things up so it doesn't become a bigger problem internally for the lender than it needs to be. And, keep track of your disclosures and have things ready. In general, the message is, you don't ever want to delay. Like most things in construction, if you solve a problem earlier in the process, it's a lot cheaper and easier to fix than, once everything's later on. And in this case, if there's actually a default, what we're seeing for everything is that lenders, to cure a default, are more inclined to ask for some sort of a fee and discuss or demand increased pricing to reflect their increased risk. If you address it in advance and they're seeing a lot of other problems and you're not a problem on the desk of this group in the bank, we're seeing borrowers get a lot better treatment. And overall, your options and available strategies, tend to narrow over time. So the earlier these things are focused on, generally the better. Now I know we're kind of short on time, but I'm transferring it over to Kate.
Great. Thanks, John. Hopefully people can stay on a little bit longer as we are a little bit past time. Before I begin, I did want to mention that for any attorneys in the audience, if you're looking to claim CLE credit, The CLE code is AR110799. That's Alpha Romeo 110799. I put it in the chat so you can take a look at it. So I'm just going to quickly do a little spotlight on commercial lending and discuss how it impacts the engineering and construction services. You know, there's been a lot of trends happening with COVID-19, and three that are applicable to our discussion right now is lease negotiation is the first one. I think as soon as the shelter-in-place orders were decreed, there was quite a bit of panic from both probably the landlord and the tenant side. Most companies around the world lease their property, their work property. They don't own it. The vast majority are leasing. So they have a relationship with a landlord and they're spending a lot of money on rent. Generally, depending on how high-end a company is, its annual costs for rent represent 10 to 25% of their business costs. So it can be a significant number, and if they're not using the space, there's concern about why they're paying for something they cannot use. So lease negotiations, renegotiations, I should say, were fairly common, requested in the beginning months of the pandemic. Often our clients would reach out to us asking as tenants if they can cancel their leases or stop paying rent. And generally the answer to that was no. Pandemics are not included as a reason for canceling rent. In general, there's very, very, very few reasons where a tenant can stop paying rent or can cancel their lease. And this would be a case of one of them. It is not a reason. So, you know, one of the things that we really tried to calm our clients down with is to, you know, and Anastasia, Matt, and John all mentioned it, working collaboratively and transparently with the other side. So talking to the landlords, explaining your problems, explaining what you can and can't do. In general, landlords want to have financially viable companies as their tenants. It's much easier to keep a tenant than to get a new tenant, especially in this strange environment that we're in now with you know, the current and post-pandemic. It's going to be a different playing field, and you know, those costs and opportunities are unknown. So keeping a tenant and keeping them financially solvent would be important to a landlord. And we did find that a lot of landlords were very happy to discuss with tenants the situation, make some concessions, whether it's rent abatement, whether it's rent forgiveness, whether it's delays of occupancy. All sorts of options were out there to try to make the situation a little bit more palatable to both sides. Another trend was an increase in terminations and a decrease in renewals. And terminations, by what I mean here, is some leases, tenants have the right to terminate their lease at a certain time. And we saw that many clients were exercising those terminations a higher percentage than previously, you know, taking the rights and then refusing the renewals at the end of their term. So allowing their leases to expire naturally, but not re-upping with the landlord. And I think that's with the expectation of either at the end of the lease term, having an alternative situation, or perhaps trying to negotiate better terms with the landlord at the end of the lease, rather than just renewing under the current terms. And then finally, for projects that were in the works, there was certainly build-out delay. Anastasia and Matt kind of mentioned delays and how the shelter-in-place impacted construction. Obviously, building out leasing space is no exception. Definitely caused some delays here. So those are just three basic trends that I wanted to mention, and then I wanted to say, well, how does that really impact you? The audience here, the engineering and construction services. Well, I think it actually causes a lot of impact and a lot of opportunity. So with the increase of lease terminations, decrease of renewals, that means there's going to be potentially more space than usual that's available and not leased in the near future. And that's, I see as, there's a lot of opportunity for repurposing that space. And repurposing space has become a very trendy word, and it's been a hot word, and it's certainly going to be applicable to your futures. Landlords are going to have buildings and spaces that no longer are necessarily appealing to companies that it was in the past. And what do they do with it? Having creative and innovative ideas of how to change space is important. A good example is malls. Malls are having a hard time. Huge department stores are closing because they just can't, they can't survive the last few months. Finding another use for a huge department store in a mall has been a challenge, but some people have found this as a great opportunity. For example, Amazon has been using old department stores, former department stores, I should say, as now fulfillment centers. So creating opportunity from the pandemic is still definitely a possibility. And then the other element is that the whole work at home situation. So during the shelter in place, obviously the majority of the office working community was forced to work from their house instead of from an office. And this has had a lot of impact on in a lot of situations. So one thing that it has done is people have found that whether they like or don't like working from home. And it's also kind of been, I think, eye-opening to companies that are traditionally not allowed working at home. It's taught them that there's actually some positives to that. There's certain cost savings, there's certain employee satisfaction where people are enjoying working from home and they would like to continue going forward. I know a lot of companies are sending out surveys to their employees requesting their thoughts on whether or not they would like to continue working from home, either on a part-time or full-time basis after the pandemic. And what are the drawbacks and positives to doing that? So I think what we're seeing is that the space of the workplace is going to be changing. There's going to be a lot of changes, a lot more hoteling type of arrangements where companies realize that they don't need to have an office or a workspace for every single employee at all times. They can consolidate their spaces, and they can create a hoteling situation where there's workspaces or offices for just the number of people that are likely to be in that space on any given day. So this would mean that large buildings are not necessarily always needed for companies. There'll be smaller spaces, or perhaps smaller spaces in different pockets. So having a suburban hub where people can go in to work in their office instead of going all the way downtown where everyone is. That if they want to come in, they can work in the suburban hub for a little bit, and then they can work at home for other times. And the open office, the open office floor plan that has kind of been a trend for the last while is now changing to something called like a dynamic workplace. So they're understanding through these discussions with their employees what is and isn't important to them and what they do and don't miss from their work environment. I think a lot of companies have found that having spaces that are very, collaborative oriented so that people can sit around and talk and have discussions, and then having focus areas. I think for any of you who have been working from home and don't have your own office at home, having focus place is very important when you have kids or significant others or even animals. It's nice to be able to close yourself off from the rest of the house and get some work done sometimes. And so I think that this just kind of comes to my point that there's a lot of opportunity and innovation in the future of how we work and where we work. And that falls very heavily on the construction and engineering services, in my mind, both just generally remodeling and redesigning and large, not even large, just office spaces, and also having a newfound appreciation for the home office. So generally, even construction and engineering that is usually focused on commercial, there may be opportunity to focus on residential, be it actual residential work or residential work for larger corporations, for top executives, things like that. The home study has largely disappeared from most people's homes, but that is something that we are anticipating will reappear in the future. So redesigning space in a house so that you have a separate space to work from home. And we see that coming certainly as part of the needs and desires of the workforce, especially the younger generations who like the flexibility and don't see working with going into an office as synonymous. So I think I can just stop there, and I don't know if we have any questions. I'll hand it over to Esper.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Esber Androglu. I'm the director of the MSc in Construction Management program. And thank you very much, Baker McKenzie team, Anastasia, Matthew, Katie, and John, for this very engaging and timely presentation on resilience, recovery, renewal, and impacts on construction, design, and engineering sectors during COVID-19. I know we're running a little bit tight with time and we're over time, but while you were presenting, there are a few questions and I'll just pick one if we can tackle quickly. And so the question is, how is force majeure or acts of God treated across cost plus, fixed fee, or stipulated sum contracts? If any difference on the treatment, or if all the agreements containing the same type of clauses for all those cases.
I'll take this one. So the likelihood is that the force majeure clause is not going to look any different whether you've got a cost plus type contract or whether you've got a fixed fee or stipulated sum arrangement. The nature of the force majeure mechanism is to I think, as I mentioned, the focus is on offering release from obligations, and what that translates into in a construction contract is if there's a force majeure event, typically the contractor will be granted an extension of time, which therefore releases it from exposure to liquidated damages if it's late. They don't typically offer the opportunity for the contractor to claim any cost related to the delay or to the particular circumstances which have caused that delay. That does depend on the specific terms of the contract, because it's a point that can be negotiated, and there are occasions where you do see cost availability for force majeure events. All of that said, you do find yourself in a slightly different position if you have got a cost plus contract as opposed to a stipulated someone if there is a force majeure event, because if and again, this is going to turn on what qualifies as cost of work and what's excluded. But you may, if you're under a pure cost plus contract and you incur additional costs because there's been delays or impacts caused by COVID, it may very well be the case that you can claim all of those costs in as a usual cost of the work, and because they're uncapped and there's no fixed amount, you find yourself able to claim for both the time and cost implications. If you're under a stipulated sum contract, then you don't have that that benefit. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Yes, thank you very much for that. And I'll do one more quickly, and this is more of a comment and question at the same time. So as we move to work remotely, data security has taken a more relevant importance. Cyber attacks are finding an easier path through the open networks. Any thoughts from the legal perspective or your experiences in the sector on this topic?
I would just make the comment that that is certainly an important aspect, and that is, as I had mentioned quickly that passingly that working from home may save company certain costs. However, that is one cost that a company might incur more from working from home, having to increase their data security, having to consider these problems and to try to plan to keep their employees and their employees' information secure. It's certainly a little harder to do when it's coming from work at home situations as opposed to from a kind of an internal focused network. But that is a big trending issue, and I know our data security people are spending a lot of time working with our clients on that. So it is a very important element to the changing work environment, and I think we're going to see a lot of additional probably software and programs and companies probably coming out of it that will address that specifically.
And on top of that, it's not just cybersecurity. There's the related issue of data privacy. I've done telehealth remote appointments, and one nurse practitioner was working from home, and the doctor was in another location. So they're related. Obviously, if there's a security breach from a remote employee, my data is protected by HIPAA. If that gets out, they're responsible. So these are huge considerations to look into. And I think it'll dovetail nicely to a future discussion on the digitization infrastructure and the cybersecurity, data privacy, and other concerns as we move everything generally to sort of the smart cities, the smart world, and Internet of Things. These are some of the highest concerns, and I think that would hopefully we'll be addressing that, and the program will be addressing that in future webinars.
Well, thank you very much for that. And as we conclude this very productive hour of discussion, on behalf of College of Engineering, I would like to thank Provost Dirk for his opening remarks, which highlighted University of Miami's educational mission and our interdisciplinary MSCM program strengths and relevance in our communities, and not only during this COVID-19 pandemic, but as we also face multitude of challenges as a result of climate change impacts globally. I would also like to thank College of Engineering Alumni Association for jointly hosting this in partnership with the MSCM program. MSCM Program Industry Advisory Board co-chairs Anna Vega Milton and John Murphy, along with our corporate sponsors, Jose Milton and Associates, and of course, Baker McKenzie and the entire presentation team today. It is your support and these type of collaborative efforts which validates our program and signifies our relevance in the communities. I would like to conclude by noting to please be on the lookout for our next webinar, which is tentatively scheduled for early November in collaboration with Miami-Dade County Office of Resilience, addressing indoor air quality and energy impacts in commercial buildings during the pandemic and beyond. Thank you very much again for your participation today, and please stay safe.